In this lecture, I'll be discussing Chapter 3 of Singer and Baer's Introducing Medical Anthropology, the second edition, and we'll look very specifically at Chapter 3 and the components of Chapter 3, how health, disease, and illness are conceptualized by medical anthropologists, and how individuals understand these and put these into practice. We'll look at some folk understandings of health from some various ethnographic examples, some typologies of ill health. This comes from George Murdoch's work with human relation area files. The sufferer experience, the notion of disability, the stigmatization that comes along with illness and how this is associated with some sort of moral judgment of individuals. Discussion of health and human rights and how those interconnect with one another. We'll discuss illness narratives as well as embodied experiences, and finally conclude with a brief discussion of healer and sufferer conceptions of disease. So when we think about health in a broad perspective, health was defined by the World Health Organization in 1978 as not merely the absence of disease and infirmity, but the complete physical, mental, and social well-being. And this is, as Singer and Baer note, a rather utopian vision for what health can look like for individuals. It's somewhat akin to New Age wellness strategies and discussions about the complete and whole self. And it's most likely that most individuals around the planet today are not going to be able to meet these very high expectations. Kelman in 1975 came up with two different types of health, looking at how individuals are essentially functioning within their bodies and how they're feeling overall, making the division between experiential health. This is the idea of wellness, that one can do great things and feel a sense of fulfillment and accomplishment over the course of their day and of their life as a whole. Whereas functional health is essentially what we have to do. And Singer and Baer point this out in terms of going to class at a particular time or going to work at a particular time. It's what employers expect in terms of employees in order to be able to function in a capitalist system. Critical medical anthropologists, in turn, look at access to and control over the basic material and non-material resources that sustain and promote a high level of satisfaction. Health, ultimately, what Singer and Baer come to can be seen as an elastic condition which must be understood in its particular context, which includes both historical context as well as contemporary social cultural context. If we think about disease is there is a clear difference between disease and illness, and Singer and Baer spent a fair amount of time in the textbook discussing the differences between disease and illness. They start by looking at conceptions of disease. Disease, Singer and Baer maintain, is established through diagnosis by professional healers. In fact, in the United States, there are very strict rules on diagnosis and who may actually provide diagnosis. And you might have professional healers in a variety of complementary and alternative medicine that are, in fact, not permitted to make any sort of diagnosis. And so the professionalization, and that would be by their own professional ethics, that they would not be able to diagnose, that would have to be deferred to medical doctors. Disease is marked by observable signs on the body, such as things like high temperature, sweating, these sorts of things that individuals, blood pressure, heart rate, that you can observe, that you can record. It is potentially accompanied by the self-assessment of the individual as experiencing either physical and or emotional discomfort. So the characteristics of disease is that it is primarily a discrete entity. That is, it is not just a product of human attention. It exists outside of it. It's clinically identifiable, and Singer and Baer talk a little bit about the coding systems that are in place and how each particular disease is coded. And of course, this relates to all sorts of billing disputes in the context of industrial societies overall. Two, diseases are, according to Singer and Baer, distinct, discrete, as well as disjunctive. In terms of illness, illness is a cultural construction which is identified through interpretive activities or narratives, and we'll talk a little bit more about different illness narratives. Explanatory models will identify the source of distress and means to cope with it for both the healer as well as the patient. And this is particularly important where you have cross-cultural encounters or in the context of medical pluralism, where explanatory models might not necessarily match up, leading to issues of doctor-patient interaction. How it's been phrased in the medical community as patient compliance overall. We'll get a little bit more into patient compliance towards the end of this lecture. Taken together, health, disease, and illness, according to Singer and Baer, if you look at one sentence in the book on page 81, they note that health is the absence of disease. In other words, a doctor finds that the individual as disease-free and that the individual does not feel ill in any sort of way. As Singer and Baer note, the boundaries between illness and disease are fluid. Both are cultural constructions rooted in both biological as well as psychosocial processes. From here, Singer and Baer go into a discussion of different folk understandings of health. So what it means to be healthy or what is health varies depending on the particular cultural group and their own conceptions of what healthy living means and what being healthy means. For the James Bay Cree in Canada, health is part of the appropriate relationship with foods that are hunted, animals that are hunted for, as well as foods that are gathered. And illness is seen for the James Bay Cree as originating both within their culture as well as a distinct separate category, those types of illnesses that result in contact with European peoples. For the Kung in the Kalahari Desert, you see sweat as a life-giving substance, and the ability to sweat is thus viewed as being healthy. For the Matsinga in southeastern Peru, there's the sense of contentment, productivity, being well-fed, and freedom from illness. The Tongans in Polynesia look at the importance of mana, or the endowment of supernatural power, as a means of health. Earlier, in the first day of class, I talked very specifically about traditional Chinese medicine. And the Han of China, the dominant cultural group and political group in China, view health as a harmonious relationship between humans, between different human beings, as well as between humans and the cosmos as a whole. Health, thus, for the Han, is a careful balance and flow of various substances, including qi or qi, or this personal energy that circulates. And any sort of blockage in that flow would lead to ill health. Along in the context of traditional Chinese medicine, as I discussed, along the context of work on clearing meridians to block any kyo or jitsu points, any points where there's a high energy or low energy, to bring an overall flow and balance to the system as a whole. George Murdoch, who has been critiqued by ethnoscientists and cognitive anthropologists for his work on the human relation area files, established various typologies. These typologies are classificatory systems using Western categories, and this is where the critique comes in from ethnoscientists and cognitive anthropologists, because the belief from their perspective is that you must elicit these domains from the particular context within which you're working. So Spradley's work, particularly on flops, as an example of ethnosemantic elicitation in the cognitive anthropology framework. So what Murdoch does is he uses this classificatory system using these Western categories, and he situates indigenous practices and beliefs, such as theories of disease or illness, in medical anthropology within these. For example, the humoral system that we discussed earlier in the class from the Greeks of health and illness. Now, again, this originates with the Greeks. It sees manifestation very similar in the context of Latin America. For the Greeks, there was a balance of the humors to reflect natural elements of air, water, earth, and fire. You have the humoral system present in Ayurvedic medicine as well as in traditional Chinese healing. The sufferer experience. I will talk a little bit about this in the context of the work that Singer and Baer have covered in the text. In the United States, the sufferer experience is looked at as the tension between maintaining hope, which is a militant commitment to fight against the disease and for health, and losing hope, spreading disease, the idea of spreading disease overall. In some parts of Latin America, emotions are seen as powerful forces that can cause illness or even the emotions themselves can become illness. For example, in Brazil, the metaphor of swallowing frogs in order to avoid interpersonal conflicts. That is, you don't necessarily say or confront the person, and instead you swallow that, you don't voice that, and this ultimately leads to an illness. In terms of cultural emotions, there's much talk within anthropology of subjectivity, and Singer and Baer discuss on this quite a bit in the text. Subjectivity is the inner life processes and affective states of individuals. Illness is experienced within cultural frameworks of understanding, discussed with emotive cultural metaphors as well as themes. Hence, culture, according to Singer and Baer, is a cognitive and emotional system. And metaphor becomes the way that fear is confronted. Illness is seen, for example, as a wake-up call for salvation in the context of individuals suffering from life-threatening diseases. Critical medical anthropologists find culturally meaningful reasons for why a person gets sick, as well as considering those that are marginalized in political and economic systems and how that marginalization impacts them in a negative way overall. So more of these structural factors that we'll be discussing later in the text when we get more into health disparity, and later in the class when we get into structural violence. The idea of social suffering, the immediate personal experience of broad human problems caused by cruel exercise of political and economic power. So some examples of this would be forced abortion, coerced sterilization, or sterilization without the knowledge of women, such as African American women in the United States. We've seen more recent reports of indigenous women in Peru. Political rape, rape used as a weapon of war. Cultural trauma, wounds that contribute to the construction of identity overall. And so the text gives a couple of examples of slavery in African Americans, as well as the Holocaust and Jewish people. We also see this with boarding schools and Alaska Native and Native Americans overall. Murphy's The Body Silent talks about disability. There's a whole field in anthropology and outside of anthropology and disability studies. And it really, the section here and what we'll be discussing later in the class looks at this idea of normativity. And for Murphy, the idea of himself completely shifts when he loses the use of his legs. And this is seen as losing an essential part of himself. His lower self-worth, his sense of self, he has a feeling of embarrassment, and the selective blindness that he sees all around him, where people aren't acknowledging him as a person. And so this field here starts to challenge what being normal actually means. Ablon, in another example from the text, discusses Little People in America in 1992, discusses the social exclusion of the dwarf body. Babylon notes that dwarfs do not experience themselves as disabled, but rather they experience themselves and their bodies as normal. At the same time, in rural Korea, some blind men have special social status and power, the eyesight of the mind, they are able to tell the future, bring rain, and consulted for business ventures overall, rather than being stigmatized. This is the way in which divergent or non-healthy body is viewed as a reflection of the moral failures of an individual. A fear of diagnosis with a disease, as it will be interpreted by the self or other members of society as a result of poor decisions. So being diagnosed as HIV positive can have social ramifications for an individual. So there's a pressure not to know. And this can act as a barrier to seeking out treatment as well as prevention. There's much discussion in anthropology, particularly when we look at this in a global context and the interface of anthropologists in the global context, and these universal human rights. And so this brings up questions of cultural relativism overall, as well as ethnocentrism. Are universals, such as Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international instruments, ethnocentric? Should anthropologists embrace these whilst working in the context of cultural relativism? Can anthropologists be objective observers? How have these beliefs changed over time in the discipline of anthropology? And Speed talks a little bit about this with critically engaged activist research. We'll talk more about these in class. Finally, I'll talk a little bit about illness narratives. This is the intent to humanize biomedicine. And you could see a couple examples here from Kleinman as well as Frank. One unintended outcome of the modern transformation of the medical care system is that it does just about everything to drive the practitioner's attention away from the experience of illness, so the sense of disembodiment. People telling their illness stories do not simply describe their bodies give their stories their particular shape and direction. So this idea of embodiment becomes really important.